This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Keagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Anisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of work. I'm Jovanni. Here with me today is Keagan. Thank you for joining us today. Keagan, how are you doing today?
I'm excellent, Jovanni. As excellent as I can be under these circumstances, but
Weather over there where you're at?
it's in the 40s and raining. Typical Portland weather.
Yeah. All right, so we're in San Antonio, 70 degrees today. What's up? All right, so let's dig in what we're talking about in this episode. We're exploring how seemingly separate global flashpoints might actually connect under a broader U.S. strategy to contain China. From tensions on the Cambodia-Thailand border to Japan's increasingly aggressive rhetoric, we'll look at how Washington's network of proxy states in the Pacific serves both land and sea encirclement of China. We also discuss China's puzzling abstention on the Gaza Trump plan at the UN Security Council, questioning how its principle of non-intervention align with international law duty to prevent genocide. What does it say about China's global posture? What does it mean for countries like Venezuela and other global South countries that align with Beijing and Moscow through BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, under the threat of Western retaliation? And finally, we'll take a quick look at what the latest U.S. national security strategy reveals about Washington's long-term priorities. All it ties back to one big question: how secure can any state feel when stepping outside of the shadows of Western control? Let's discuss this with our returning guest, KJ Noh. KJ Noh is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and educator specializing in Asia-Pacific geopolitics. His writing appears in outlets including Dissident Voice, Black Agenda Report, Counterpunch, Popular Resistance, Asia Times, Morning Review Online. He provides regular commentary for programs such as The Critical Hour, By Any Means Necessary, Fault Lines, KPFA Flashpoints, and he hosts The China Report, a weekly program on breakthrough news. KJ, we're honored to have you back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. And lots to cover in so little time. I know that when we talked initially online and I brought up some of the topics that I wanted us to explore, he said that it was a lot of topics, but hopefully we can skim through a few of them and get a little bit of clarity of what's going on in the world today. As there seems to be conflicts everywhere, it seems to be people like in our posture seems to be seen just being overwhelmed with so much tension and conflicts all around the world. So let's try to make sense of it with the time that we have here today. I want to talk about one of the recent things that has been happening in Southeast Asia, which hasn't made a lot of news here in the West, and is the Cambodia-Thailand border war that just happened. I know they have had conflicts since the 60s, been on and off. But recently, their tension has escalated. In the last few weeks, Thailand and Cambodia they had a ceasefire, and they went back into a shooting border war again. This is rooted in decades-old disputes, competing claims over Cambodia's pre-Vihir temple, with Thailand sits as its own. Cambodia has an ironclad relationship with China for decades. Thailand has been a long-term strategic partner of the United States. Does this conflict, does it have anything to do with the containment of China from Washington's perspective?
I think it may have. And I think the person that I would refer people to is Brian Berletic, who lives in Thailand, and he's unpacked it in a pretty detailed fashion. But one of the things to understand is that Thailand actually has good relations with China. On the other hand, Cambodia may be playing a dual role or vacillating. We know that the new incoming leader, Hun Sen, was trained at West Point. He is a West Point graduate. And so there is a very strong connection with the United States and with the Western elite. He also went to Bristol University, did a degree in economics. And so there are some complex dynamics happening. But one of the first things that we have to ask ourselves, of course, we're seeing it framed as border disputes, and that is not incorrect. And these are borders that go back to the colonial era. They have to do with the French drawing up some very ambiguous borders and then some UN rulings that kind of split the difference. And that has left this ICJ rulings that have left some lingering conflicts. And then that suddenly exploded into kinetic combat. The Thai have alleged that there have been new mines that have been planted, which is a very hostile act. You might argue that perhaps these are old mines that have drifted, which is not unheard of, especially in hilly terrain after rain. But whatever is happening, there is real conflict. There are jets that are bombing sites. And so this is not a trivial conflict. And the most recent report, which also is very disturbing, is that there are FPV drones that are being used. And these are very advanced drones. These are not drones that Cambodia would make themselves. These are FPV drones that are being used on the battlefield. They are jam-proof because they're using fiber optic cables. And according to the Thai military and the Thai press, these are being controlled by English-speaking troops or English-speaking operators. That is very ominous. So whatever is going on, I would say that the hand of the empire is involved, and we can see this as a kind of large arc of instability, which is happening all around Southeast Asia, certainly around China's periphery. The largest, most obvious conflict is Myanmar, which also has a strong Western influence, a strong Western hand, in particular, the attempt to undermine the gas pipelines going through Rakhine State and into Cat Phu Port. All of that was being sabotaged up until the point of the coup. And now we see this ongoing civil war. It's a legacy of 70 years of civil war, once again created by colonial rivalries, colonial divide and conquer. But it has continued up to this point, and it is creating a massive destabilizing influence in the region, and in particular through the use of these online scam centers that are run on slave labor. It's a kind of reversion to this primitive capitalist accumulation, this simply using slavery as a form of accumulation. And we see that in Myanmar, in parts of Myanmar, and we also see the same problem in Cambodia. Whoever is involved in facilitating this probably has connections to the United States, because these scam slave labor centers could not function without the internet. And the US controls the backbone of the internet. If they're using Elon Musk's what is that thing?
Starlink,
exactly. If they're using Starlink is implicated in these online scam centers.
Yes, not too long ago, we also had the step down of the Prime Minister of Nepal, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, in a supposed Gen Z revolution when she stepped down. What's interesting about it, that she also had an explicit pro-China relationship built around strategic, economic, and diplomatic alignment. And this Gen Z protest, which it seems to be exploding in a lot of places nowadays. You saw in Mexico not too long ago, there was this other Gen Z revolution type thing. But it caused her to step down. It seems like this is arc of instability, not only happening inland, also you see how they're the allies in the Pacific and pretty much corralling around China. You have South Africa, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, pretty much part of this opus type thing. There's this ring around China. Recently, the Japanese prime minister made some statements, some concerning statements on Japan about China, and China did react to it. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, that's very important, and it is very elucidating for what's going on in the general global sphere. But just a few more words about Nepal. I think it's pretty well established at this point that Nepal was a US-funded color revolution. There's almost no doubt about it. The NED was crawling all over the place. All the funding seems to have come out of the United States or US affiliated organizations, NED, USA, AID type organizations. And the thing to understand is that you do not bring down an established government after 1 week of street protests. That just doesn't happen. Those of us who have ever been in the streets, who spent decades protesting and organizing, you do not bring an established government down in 1 week with a few days of protest. You have to know that there is a stronger, more powerful hand that is acting. And in this case, it seems to be very clear that this was the United States. So Nepal was definitely a color revolution. Many of these Gen Z protests seem to have very strong connections with the United States. And I would argue that this is empire through other means. This is the empire's dirty hand working through other means, through hybrid war. And we're seeing it all over the place. Primarily, you see it in countries that are BRICS, countries that allied with the rising multipolar world led by China. But coming back to the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, she said some pretty astounding things. This was in the Japanese parliament, the Diet, and she proclaimed that if there was a Taiwan contingency, this would be a Japan contingency. She said that if there were warships deployed around Taiwan Island, which, let's be very clear, is part of China's sovereign territory. The UN recognizes it, China recognizes it, the US recognizes it, 180 odd countries recognize it as the case, and even Taiwan Island, the Taiwan authorities, the ROC themselves, recognize themselves as part of China. That's why they're officially called the Republic of China. But Taiwan Island or Taiwan province is a part of China. And what Sanae Takaichi said essentially was that if China exercises its sovereign rights, doing sovereign actions within its sovereign territory, Japan will consider this to be a survival threatening situation. Let me say that again. A survival threatening situation. Why did she say that? Japan technically is not supposed to have a military. It was disarmed after World War II, and they were put into the penalty box because they were essentially the psycho killers of Asia. They committed genocide all over the place. They colonized Korea. They colonized parts of northern China. In the process, they killed off 35 million, and then they went off and colonized most of Southeast Asia. And along the way, they kidnapped 400,000 women into sexual slavery, where 90% of the women would die during their sexual enslavement. They ran Unit 731, which was a medical experimentation camp, which made the Nazis look like Boy Scouts. They would impregnate women and then cut their wombs open and then experiment with the fetuses and freeze people and then break their limbs, and subject them to all kinds of torture and different ways of murder, stabbing, burning, etc. All of this, quote unquote, in the interest of furthering science. It was truly one of the most heinous psychopathic experiments, psychopathic projects in the history of mankind. But anyway, they ran Unit 731. They conducted the Nanjing massacre, which was 300,000 people killed in a single city, raped, murdered, bludgeoned to death. And the atrocities go on and on and on. And after World War II, they were disarmed, and their constitution was written for them by the US, which had the Article 9, which was a clause which says that Japan will never have a military again. It will never have the means to wage war again. And that worked well for most of the Japanese, but there was a group of unrepentant militarists that always wanted to get rid of Article 9. They wanted, in their words, to become a normal nation again, that is to have a nation with a military, which is really an understatement because what these people really wanted was to reestablish the Japanese empire. These were the unrepentant militarists, the war criminal class. And the United States put this war criminal class back into power. People like Kishi Nobusuke, who was the Minister of Munitions of Manchukuo, he was put right back into power. These people, without any exaggeration, were human monsters. They were psychopaths. They were literally the worst of the worst. But these people were put back into power by the United States, and in particular, in the form of this party called the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. And this party was agglomeration of the war criminals and the military industrialists, the Zaibatsu, all the companies the industrialists that had formed the backbone of the Japanese military industrial complex, and the Yakuza, organized crime, with a big boost from the Moonies, actually. And they were all brought together and funded by the CIA. This is well-established history. And this party, the LDP, took power of Japanese politics, and it has held continuous one-party rule over Japanese politics since 1955, with the 8-month exception, short glitch in the matrix for 8 months. But otherwise, they have had one-party rule over Japan, and they run the country as a one-party state that is a subcontractor and a vassal of the United States. You have to understand, Japan's constitution was created by the United States. It has U.S. troops on it. Its ruling party was put into place by the United States. When they were growing too fast and too big, the U.S. imposed this thing called the Plaza Accord, which told the Japanese to essentially revalue their currency and change the economy, and they did all of that. So when the U.S. tells Japan to do something, the Japanese say, how high? It's that simple. Japan is a U.S. base, it's a U.S. subcontractor, it's a U.S. vassal. Inside this context, Sanae Takaichi belongs to the extreme far right of the Japanese ultra-right of the LDP. She's currently the president, but she belongs to what is called the Seiwa faction, which was the faction that Shinzo Abe belonged to. And these are the people who believe in recreating the Japanese empire. They believe that Japan did nothing wrong during World War II. They're unrepentant militarists. They're total historical revisionists. They deny every war crime that Japan has ever committed. And of course, they routinely visit Yasukuni Shrine, where the war criminals' spirits are entombed, and they worship at Yasukuni Shrine. And Shinzo Abe, for example, he rode a plane where they emblazoned the letters 731 on the cockpit. This is how in your face they are, how in your face unrepentant they are. They flaunt their atrocities. By the way, Japanese airplanes usually have 5-digit numbers or 4-digit numbers or 6-digit numbers. There is no Japanese plane that has a 3-digit numbering scheme. So they actually scrubbed out whatever original number that had, and they put 731 on that plane just so that Shinzo Abe could give the middle finger to the world and to the Chinese and to the Koreans. So anyway, this is the LDP. This is the faction that Sanae Takaichi belongs to. And she also belongs to Nippon Kaigi, which also is the monarchist imperial faction of the Japanese ruling elite. And when she used the words, or when she stated that Taiwan would be a Taiwan contingency would be a survival-threatening situation, what she was saying was that we will go to war over Taiwan Island. And essentially, our defense perimeter extends all the way to Taiwan. That is, Taiwan is ours. It's part of our own defense perimeter. That is an extraordinarily escalatory and provocative statement. And the Chinese were rightly incensed by it. It's also the language that is written into the 2015 legislation by Shinzo Abe, where he said that if there is a survival-threatening situation, Japan can wage aggressive expeditionary war. So this is the casus belli clause that has been written into the Japanese law, and she invoked it for Taiwan, linking the two together. This is the first time anybody has done this, and essentially it amounts to a threat or a provocation, or one could almost say a declaration of war against China. This term, survival-threatening situation, is also the language Japan has always used when it attacks other countries. It did that in 1894, in 1931, in 1937, and 1941. It always used that word, survival-threatening situation. In other words, this is the killer cop excuse that Japan has invoked. When the police shoot, they say, I felt that my safety was threatened. My survival this was a survival-threatening situation. She's put that into the public domain and into Japanese legal doctrine, and is extraordinarily dangerous escalatory action that she has engaged in publicly.
I was wondering, like, I've been looking a lot of stuff about her, just see her history and like what kind of woman she is. She's got a really interesting history coming up through the party and everything. But I think just like talking about China, do you feel like you see these localized conflicts as organic or as externally encouraged pressure points meant to destabilize China?
I think they're externally encouraged because the U.S. has had a grand strategy of containing, provoking, and rolling back China, taking China down. This goes all the way back to the 1992 Wolfowitz Doctrine, but more recently, the pivot to Asia, air-sea battle, which was drafted in 2010. This is a doctrine of war against China that they drafted in 2010, and they've revised it 9 times. And you can see this constant escalation, the constant information warfare, the constant military exercises, the constant staging, logistical preparation and staging of the Pacific theater for war. Now, in this context, did Sanae Takaichi mention Taiwan as a survival-threatening situation because she was prompted to? Probably not. I think what she did instead was she said the silent part out loud. She was not supposed to say that. Everybody knows that this is the plan. It's actually written into Elbridge Colby's, he has an entire book called Strategy of Denial, which is all about waging war against China, using Taiwan as a trigger or provocation. It's all out there. So she simply recited the doxa, but she was supposed to keep it silent. She wasn't supposed to say it out loud. And what she did was she said the quiet part out loud. And that is the big scandal. And this is why there's such a big reaction from China.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because you see the Japanese faction that you just mentioned, and there's a South Korean faction as well. They're also very gung-ho about it, and they're very reactionary, very anti-communist. But I'm wondering about the Filipino equation here. They seem to be like the weakest link here, but also they're being animated into this hostility for China. Is there faction within the Philippine political class that has that, or are they being prompted to take that position?
Well, Marcos, the current Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, is the son of Ferdinand Marcos, who was a wholly U.S.-controlled dictator and puppet. He was the ultimate U.S. puppet, along with Park Chung-hee and Chiang Kai-shek and a few others in East Asia. This was the axis of anti-communist fascists that was in place. So Marcos, the elder Marcos, was a U.S. puppet. the apple did not fall far from the tree. And it's largely suspected that there are hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars that the Marcos family squirreled away in the West that are actually being held back from them. And in order for them to recuperate this, they have to do what they're told to. I don't know if that's true, but it does seem plausible. What is a fact is that Bongbong Marcos is a creature of the American imperium. He is a subcontractor to the American imperium, just as the Philippines itself was a U.S. colony, probably more than any of the other vassals. The Philippines is the most American colony of them all. It hosted that base. What's that huge naval base? It's larger than Singapore, right? It's at its peak, it was the largest military base on the planet, larger than a country. But anyway, they've started to see if they can reestablish that. And of course, in addition to the 5 traditional bases that the U.S. has, they've added 4 more, so they have 9 bases. The key thing about the Philippines is that it controls the South China Sea. It is the western tip of the first island chain, and it leads to access and control over the South China Sea, which leads to control over the Malacca Straits. It's geostrategically one of the most important places on the planet, and it's one of the places where the United States has said that it is going to choke China out. It's going to choke China out. And because of that, the Philippines has been pulled into this escalation against China, primarily under the pretext of freedom of navigation and exclusive economic zones, and a court case that was actually initiated by CSIS, the deep state think tank. They ran this kind of fraudulent case at a private tribunal and then tried to pretend it was the United Nations. But the Philippines and the South China Sea, which they like to call the West Philippine Sea, is critical geostrategically. And they want to use the Philippines as a way, again, of provoking China. I want you to think of a face, and I want you to think of the vulnerabilities. If you were doing self-defense or martial arts, what are the vulnerabilities on the human face? The first one would be the throat or the neck. The South China Sea is the windpipe or the carotid artery of China. If you choke that off, China will die. 70% of China's oil and $5 trillion worth of China's goods trade travels through the South China Sea. If there is a shooting war in the South China Sea, not even if there is actually a war, but if there is just enough shooting to disrupt trade, Rand Corporation has estimated that it could bring down China's economy by 25 to 35%. Essentially, it could collapse the economy. And Philippines is critical in this strategy. And that's why the U.S. has tight control over it. And that is why it is using the Philippines and the Philippine Navy to provoke China in the South China Sea at every single moment. The other vulnerability is the chin. The chin is actually Taiwan. That's the center of the first island chain. It's the center, and a blow to the chin sends shock straight into the medulla, into the subcortical regions that will knock you out. The Taiwan is like that. It is China's core interest, and it guards the 2 deep water channels that allow China to have a viable strategic deterrent. It guards those 2 channels, the Bashi Channel and the Miyako Straits. So it's important in that way. And also, it is so close to China. You have to understand, Taiwan is not simply an island. It is an archipelago. There are 140 islands. And some of these islands are within 3 miles of the Chinese coastline. In fact, Jinmen Island, which is part of Taiwan province, is swimming distance. It's literally 3 miles away from the Chinese mainland. And currently, the United States has several hundred special forces on Jinmen Island right now as we speak. So there's constant escalation and constant provocation happening. And of course, Japan is the other dimension. The other vulnerability is the nose or the bridge of the nose. That's South Korea. South Korea has always been the bridgehead onto the Chinese continent. Any naval attack either happens from Taiwan Island or from the Korean peninsula. It's literally the on-ramp onto the peninsula. And usually it happens at the same time. Historically, it has always happened. The two have always gone together. But Korea is the other vulnerability for China. And then, of course, Japan is this kind of long alligator-shaped island that straddles 2/3 of the first island chain. And right now, the U.S. is involved in militarizing every possible spot in the Japanese island, most certainly the Okinawan Islands. But in the Okinawan Islands that are the closest to Taiwan Island, they are currently placing tomahawks. They're placing air-to-air missiles, air-to-land missiles, missile defense systems. Anything missile, deadly, and dangerous is being placed all over those small islands close to China. And the idea is to create a wall of missiles that will essentially destroy China when they provoke war, which, according to them, is going to be 2027.
Right.
Transitioning over to Gaza, at the UN Security Council, Trump presented his peace plan, which many critics saw less as a peace proposal than a demand for Palestinian capitulation. 13 countries voted in favor and 2 abstained, China and Russia. Why did China choose to abstain rather than veto the Trump plan at the Security Council?
This is something that has been misreported in the Western media, and it's really important for us to understand. The Palestinian Authority agreed to it, and they lobbied to it. They actually lobbied the Chinese government for it. Now, some people say the Palestinian Authority doesn't represent the Palestinians, and that is true. But in the eyes of the UN, they are the official representative of the PLO. And the UN authority, and the PLO is the UN authority designated to represent the Palestinians at the UN. So essentially, the Chinese or the Russians cannot go against the wishes of the representative, or it would be a violation of international protocol, not to mention a violation of sovereignty. And of course, we don't like it, we may not like it, but if the lawyer, for example, give an analogy, if the lawyer submits a guilty plea or an innocent plea or whatever, the third parties, the judge, the witnesses, they have to follow that. They don't get to judge what the representative, the lawyer, wants. Whether the lawyer has correctly represented it, that is a separate issue. And that is something that can be challenged in subsequent cases. But for the current moment, the judge and the witnesses have to follow the plea of the representative. And that's essentially the situation that happened. You can't violate international law and supersede the rights of what the authority themselves wanted. Now, the other thing to remember is all other members of the United Nations Security Council, including all the Arab states, all the Islamic states, and even Algeria, which has a history of supporting Israel and is ostensibly anti-imperialist, all of them lobbied. They all lobbied for it. They all lobbied for this UNSC 2803. So under those circumstances, neither China nor Russia could reasonably oppose it. Russia had tried to float an alternative proposal, but it got no traction by any of the other members. Once again, I emphasize all the Arab states, all the Islamic states, even Algeria lobbied for it and supported for it. And then the third thing to think about is if China or Russia had vetoed it, what do you think would have happened?
They would have ignored it. Just like should have been pretty much ignoring every UN resolution and with the support of the West And that's what's puzzling, because I know that China and Russia, right, talks about upholding international law, upholding the UN Charter, etc. But they're seeing how the West and Israel just pretty much doing a battering ram and just trampling all over international law. And you saw how with the back in the 90s, you remember the British and the Americans came up with this concept called the RP2, the
R2P, responsibility to
protect. That, you know, with the event of atrocity occurring, and they use Rwanda, they use Nika and Bosnia as case studies, that if it's possible,
they used it to wage imperial war. It was an excuse for imperial war.
And they use it against Libya. They're saying Libya, the way they use it in Libya is that if they would have not acted in Libya, hypothetically, and a genocide would have happened. It wasn't happening at the moment. Yeah. But hypothetically, if they would have intervened, it would have happened. In this case with Israel, it was happening in the eyes of the world, and international law, and was unable to do anything about it.
Yeah, so let me get back to the response to the questions. China voted for China did not veto UNSC 2803 because the Palestinian Authority agreed to it and lobbied for it. All other members of the UNSC, including the Arab states, lobbied for it. And if China and Russia had vetoed it, as you point out, exactly what you say, Israel would have simply ignored the veto, as it has ignored 103 other UN resolutions. They would have simply continued the carnage, although this time they would have blamed China and Russia. In other words, this entire thing was a trap. If they agree to it, if they don't veto it, they get their way. And if you veto it, we will kill off the Palestinians even faster and blame the parties who oppose genocide. That was the trap that was set up. In fact, the U.S. actually threatened to continue the genocide if the other countries did not fall in line. China and Russia gave the best statement possible, the best response possible under circumstance. Is this following international law? No, but we have to understand that international law is simply a rule of the powerful, except under unusual conditions. Under conditions of where things come down to brass tacks, international law is simply ignored. And then the last point I will make is that China and Russia, I believe, understood that with or without a veto, the resolution would fail, because there are no countries that are willing to offer troops to disarm Hamas, right? Israel couldn't disarm Hamas. You think Turkey's going to disarm Hamas? Egypt? No. In other words, the veto will happen on the ground, and that's really what's going to happen. And Hamas has come out and formally thanked China for its support. Even after the abstention, they've thanked China. So I think it's important to understand this larger context rather than becoming trapped in this mainstream media mythology that there's international law, the Genocide Convention requires states to intervene upon other states. First, that's wrong. Okay, anybody who tells you that is telling you something that is incorrect. The Genocide Convention requires to intervene within their own states to prosecute actors responsible, to punish and to prevent within your own state. It does not give you extrajudicial powers that allow you to interfere in other states. The only way that you intervene or affect another state is when you go through the United Nations. Unilateral sanctions are a violation of international law because sovereignty is considered inviolable. Let me give you a quick analogy. If you're a social worker or a teacher and you discover that one of your children, one of your students is being abused, that does not give you the right to go to the parent's home and directly intervene and punish the parent. You can't do that. You are mandated to report that, and then the state-sanctioned authorities take their action, but you are not allowed to take vigilante action. And the UN is structured in that same fashion, that countries cannot intervene upon other states without the mediation of the United States itself. And so when you have a clause, which you mentioned, like R2P, I've discussed this with Marjorie Cohen. She says R2P is manifestly illegal. We see that in the effects. Essentially, it was used as a pretext for aggressive imperial war. But she says there actually is no R2P. R2P doesn't exist. She said it's a series of discussions that were had at the UNSC and at the UN, but it does not constitute a body of law. And anybody who says that's the case is misguided. Now, we may feel that it's justified, but international law, as it is written right now, does not permit that. People also say, what about United for Peace, UN Resolution 377A? Let me give you, first, that is a possibility, but it's a high bar to climb. And let me give you a little bit of history about UN Resolution 377. The first thing to understand about the United Nations is that it was created to uphold the powers of the powerful nations. Okay. Why? Because originally there was a precursor to the United Nations. It was called the League of Nations. What happened to the League of Nations?
Got destroyed.
Nothing. Nothing happened.
It didn't.
It did nothing.
It did nothing. It didn't work.
Yeah.
And the reason why it didn't work is because the
Second World War.
the United States did not join the League of Nations, which essentially
Right. They proposed it actually.
Yes,
And
they opposed it.
Opposed it, but they didn't join it. And just like the UN Charter, it was signed here in San Francisco, but the U.S. pushed for it, but they violated it over and over again.
Exactly. Yes. So anyway, the League of Nations was condemned to irrelevancy. And the reason was it didn't have enough inducements for the powerful states to join. And so the United Nations, when it was established, said we have to give this kind of aristocratic privilege to the powerful nation. So we create the UNSC, like the House of Lords in the British parliamentary system. You have these hereditary lords whose only qualification is they're rich and powerful and have been since time immemorial. They get to rule the country. Same thing. Or if you will, it's like the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court has extraordinary power, but these people are appointed. Nobody ever voted for a Supreme Court judge. So the UNSC has this extraordinary power, but they did this in order to cajole and to induce the United States and other powerful countries to join. When they joined, they thought, okay, what we're also going to do is we're going to create a checks and balance inside these powerful states. And so we ensure that there is a veto. What happened, and it was one of the first key actions of the United Nations, was that the UN was used to facilitate a genocide. What genocide? This is the Korean War. Mm-hmm. Korean War should more accurately be referred to as the Korean Genocide. It killed off at least 1/5 of the people of North Korea. The entire country was covered with bombs and napalm. If you think of Gaza right now, everything flattened into a parking lot, that was North Korea. If you think of North Gaza and you expand that territory 1,200 times, that was what North Korea was, plus napalm, plus biological weapons, plus dams destroyed to flood anybody who was hiding inside a cave and so on. The entire country was turned pulverized into a moonscape. That is literally the definition of genocide, genocidal intent. And if you talk to journalists who traveled in North Korea at the time, they'll tell you it was like traveling over the surface of the moon because nothing was left standing. It was literally rubble from beginning to end. So, as the Korean War was being initiated or facilitated in the United Nations, Russia first boycotted the UNSC because they were opposed to it. They saw this as the aggressive, invasive war of aggression that it was. If you do nothing, if you only do one thing, but look at where the war started. It started on June 25th on the Ongjin Peninsula in the wee hours of the morning. That's the only thing that people agree on, North and South. if you look at the Ongjin Peninsula, you realize from the north, the Ongjin Peninsula dead ends into the sea. But from the south, the Ongjin Peninsula is a straight path, a highway all the way to Pyongyang. It would be like saying the United States invaded Mexico by starting a war in Baja California. Where does Baja California go? It goes nowhere. It goes into the sea, right? But if you look at it the other way, it goes straight towards San Diego. It's like that. So pretty clear that the South Korean, the ROK Army, which was actually under the control of the U.S. at the time, and it still is to the current moment, was the aggressor. I think there's pretty solid evidence that shows that South Korea was the aggressor. But anyway, the United States used this as a casus belli, and they were going to use the UN as the enforcer. And they flew the UN banner. And the Korean War, the Korean genocide, was done under the banner of the United Nations. And there were 4 resolutions passed, Resolution 82, 83, 84, 85. The Soviet Union boycotted all of them. And they realized that they were simply getting ramrodded through, and the war was ongoing. And so then the Soviet Union came back and said, we're going to veto this. We're actually going to use the veto. It hasn't been used before, but now we're going to use the veto. And so what the US did was say, oh, we can't let them veto anything. Let's create this new resolution, Resolution 377A, where we take it, if it gets vetoed in the UNSC, we take it to the GA and we get all our quislings and allies to vote for it and pass it. And so people think that UNSC 377A is a means of ending genocide. We'll see if that's the case. The bar is extraordinarily high, but you have to understand that the genesis of Uniting for Peace resolution was actually to continue and enable a genocide. So I think that's important context to understand.
Yeah, very heavy. And in the case of Israel, the argument of Israel's sovereignty, right, independence, and conducting a genocide is also questionable because without the support of the West, it wouldn't be able to sustain this long. The military support, financial support, political support. So it's not a sovereign state doing it on its own. It's pretty much a cabal of states enabling it. In the case of Israel.
Biden said it himself, right? He said, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. I think that we could say that Israel is simply a subcontractor to U.S. imperial design, except a subcontractor brings their own tools. Israel doesn't even have their own tools. They get all their tools from the U.S., right? They get all their weaponry from the U.S. Without U.S. weaponry and Canadian weaponry and UK and Germany and all the other Western colonial powers that are supporting it to the max, the genocide would be over in a day. It only exists by virtue of the constant and consistent support enabling political cover and logistical support and information and intelligence support that is given to it by the Western colonial powers, but most notably the United States.
Absolutely. KJ, real quick, let's move on to another topic. Recently, you wrote an article on Counterpunch about the new national security strategy of the United States under Trump that I think was published in December this month, 2025.
Yes.
I read your article first. I had it was sent to me when it was first published, but I had a chance to read it. And I read your article, and then I skimmed through it, but I had to go back and read. I got to go back and read it again. And it sounds very conjoined. It sounds like it's all over the place. And it doesn't sound coherent. It says many things at the same time. It doesn't say much. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know that you said that is a public one, but there's also the secret one as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is very important to understand. The national security strategy was mandated by the Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act of 1986. And it is essentially the business plan of the empire. It is the strategic business plan of the empire. But the thing to understand is that it is a secret plan. Nobody who is commenting in the mainstream media has ever seen what the actual plan is. It is a classified plan. And the only thing that we see is the PR pamphlet. So we're not actually seeing the business plan. We're seeing the PR pamphlet. If you were, let's say you belong to the investor class and you're going to decide whether to invest in a company or not, do you go by the PR pamphlet or do you do your own due diligence?
Yeah.
You have to do your own diligence. So, yeah. So if you read it on the surface, it gives you unicorns and butterflies and horses and ponies and bread and roses and everything. There's something for everybody. And you can interpret it any way you want to, which is why you get such divergent interpretations. Some people say it's a complete retrenchment. Other people say it's complete expansionist, etc. But the key thing to read it for is you read it for the contradictions, because the contradictions are where you're going to start seeing where the truth is. You have to parse out the contradictions and then start to think about how to explain them and how to understand it. And that work is an interpretive task. It's like reading an ancient text and trying to figure out what it really means. But it is a bit of work. But you have to ignore all the red meat that's thrown out for everybody. That is a distraction. In fact, the people who draft the national security strategy have a term for it. They call it the Christmas tree effect or the Christmas tree version. This is what they call it themselves. They say you put out all these shiny, dangling objects on the tree and you have gifts for everybody. And that's the version that we're exposed to, the Christmas tree version. But what you have to really understand is you have to look for the contradictions. And then I don't know if either of you guys do any programming, but when you program, there's this thing called code, which is what tells the machine to do things. And then there's this thing called remarks or comments, which you can write in between the code, which explains what the code is supposed to be doing. The remarks don't do anything. You can put anything you want to into the remarks. You can write a love letter to your grandmother into the remarks, but it won't do anything. The only thing that matters in the code are the actual lines of code. So distinguish between the code and the remarks. If you think of it that way, look at the national security strategy and you start to look for the code and not the remarks, then it starts to make sense. And so then people who say that, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, the U.S. has changed, it's doing this Donroe Doctrine, it's retreating to the Western Hemisphere. Look carefully at the text. The United States says that it's retreating to the Western Hemisphere, but its security perimeter extends all the way out to the first island chain of Taiwan and the entire Pacific. And it specifically has all kinds of content around the South China Sea. In particular, it says it's preventing any obstruction of access through the South China Sea. Nonsense. All of that trade goes to and from China. The Chinese have no reason to obstruct that trade. So for the U.S. to say that it needs to ensure the freedom of that trade, of that navigation through the South China Sea, is absurd on its face. But just notice that contradiction, that you say that you're focusing on the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, the U.S. has always focused on the Western Hemisphere. It has always had a Monroe Doctrine. This is nothing new. So anybody who says this is new doesn't know anything about history. It has always interfered in Latin America.
Oh, the Trump corollary?
Yes, the Trump coronary. Coronary.
To the Monroe Doctrine. And you just mentioned the Pacific and China, right? China, at the time, this is China for the first time, I don't know, in ages, and first time ever, I think a lot of Latin American countries have China as their first business partner, which is also concerning to Washington, that a lot of Latin American countries have China as their number one trading partner.
Yes.
It also has a lot to do with this as well.
Yes, exactly. And that's a big part of the Donroe Doctrine, is to make sure that countries cut China out of their supply chains and that China should not be allowed to have economic interests or economic relations in the Western Hemisphere. That's a key part of it. It's also a key part of competing, quote unquote, competing with China. But essentially, once again, look at the code, look at the contradictions. And if you do that, you'll notice that the core code, the kernel code, is that the US is an empire, and it insists and intends to continue to be an empire. And everything else is just comments, remarks, bright, shiny, dangling things on the Christmas tree. It's essentially the carnivore does not become a vegetarian. The McDonnell Douglas is not going to become a nonprofit charity. It's just not in its DNA. And you see exactly the same thing here. National security strategy is the business plan of empire. The empire is not going to become vegetarian. It is still a carnivore. And anybody who thinks otherwise is simply getting distracted by the shiny ornaments. They're reading the remarks and not the code. They're not interpreting the code. To understand the code, look at the continuity of agenda. You can see it all the way through the successive national security strategies. You can also see it through in everything else that is being said and done, including the Munich Declaration and everything else that the Trump hexeth, everything that they have said. And also the other thing to look for is the NSS is only the first of a chain of documents. The NSS is the first one, and then you will get the National Defense Strategy, and then you will get the National Military Strategy, and you will get the Nuclear Posture Review, and the National Missile Review, etc. So there's a spate of documents that will come out, and look for them because those will be more technical and more nuts and bolts. And then you will see this continuous continuity of agenda. Empire continues. There's minor retrenchment, minor tweaking, minor changing of the rhetoric. They want to slap down the Europeans because the Europeans didn't perform well in the Ukraine war, and the US hates it when their vassals don't do well in war. And so they're slapping them around with the identity politics issues and the immigration issue. The immigrants are in Europe because of US wars. US wage war, and that's why they're immigrants in Europe. And as for the identity politics, all of that is projection. The reason why Europeans aren't doing well has to do with the contradictions of their own neoliberal societies as vassals of the United States and the fact that the US blew up their energy source, the Nord Stream pipeline. And they're being blamed for being victims and bad vassals. And to a certain extent, they were asking for it. It is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it is deadly to be an ally. They're seeing what that Kissinger dictum is really like. But at the heart of it, the national security strategy is a continuity of agenda. It's the empire, as usual, but it's also the empire on the cheap. It's the US wants empire with all the fixings on it, but it wants it cheaper because of its own economic struggles. And so essentially the message of the national security strategy, especially to the Europeans and the NATO nations, is that essentially we are the slumlord. We own your apartment, we own your property, and we're going to raise the rent. Everybody pay 5% into your military budget, and you got to buy more weapons from the company store, or else you're in trouble. But essentially it's telling them we own you and we can raise the rent anytime we want, and you have to start tithing to us. This is the message.
That's heavy. I think it's a good place to wrap up for the day, KJ. Yeah, a lot to ponder. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your time, your thoughts, your experiences with us. Any final comments before we go?
I think that we have to understand that things, even though they look bleak, I think there's that thing about having pessimism of the mind and optimism of the will, that we understand that we see reality as it is, and that also inspires us to be more active and more engaged and more intentional in our actions. If we can do that, I think we can make a difference. And also be very careful about the propaganda. The NSS is a propaganda statement. It is PR con job. Do not be misled by it. Empire continues. And that means we have to step up our game, continue to step up our game, and don't let yourself be distracted and mystified and confused by all the propaganda that's coming at you left and center. Connect with people, continue to take action, whatever that means, whether in the streets or on your keyboard, whatever that is. Continue to fight against this war machine, because war is coming and we're not going to get a second chance to stop it. We're in critical times, but we can make a difference if we all work together.
KJ, where can we find our work, your work? Where do we go for more information and actions that you consider that most of us should take?
Interesting that you should ask that. My good comrade Finian Cunningham, fantastic journalist and editor, and Dan Kovalik and Jeremy Kuzmarov and Ron Ridenauer, all amazing journalists. We've written a book together. It's called Killing Democracy. Killing Democracy, Western Imperialism's Legacy of Regime Change and Media Manipulation. It's getting really good reviews. So I invite people who are interested in reading more, get the book, Killing Democracy. And then also, if you go online, you'll see there several hundred, several thousand interviews, articles that I've put out there.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you guys soon. Take care. Look us up on wherever you listen to podcasts. Give us a like on YouTube and share it with a friend. And I'm looking forward to our next show. Take care, everybody.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.